They weren't just matches, they were war zones. 12 days when British football descended into chaos. From the terraces of the 70s to the dark days of the 80s and even into the 2000s, rival fans turned stadiums into battlegrounds. Police overwhelmed, players caught in the crossfire, lives lost. These weren't just riots. They were the moments that scarred football forever. This is the story of Britain's most violent stadium riots. Sheffield United versus West Brom, April 2002, Brom Lane. It was meant to be just another Division 1 fixture, but with promotion on the line and tempers running hot, the atmosphere was toxic. In the final minutes, a series of bad tackles and confrontations on the pitch spilled into the stands. Hundreds of fans invaded the pitch, some to celebrate, others to settle scores. Police were overwhelmed, and for a few minutes the stadium was a battlefield. Dozens were arrested. The FA called it one of the most shameful scenes in modern English football. Manchester United versus Arsenal, October 1990, Old Trafford. It was billed as a clash of two title contenders, but the tension exploded long before the final whistle. A reckless tackle sparked a confrontation between Nigel Winterburn and Dennis Irwin, and within seconds, every outfield player was involved. Punches flew, shirts were grabbed, and the scuffle spilled toward the crowd, who roared the brawl on. Referees and officials struggled to restore order, and the game teetered on the edge of abandonment. When it was over, both clubs were fined heavily. Arsenal were docked 2 points, and the incident went down as one of the most infamous on-pitch fights in English football history. Newcastle United versus Sunderland, 90s. The Tyne-Wear derby has never been for the faint-hearted, but during the 90s it reached boiling point. On one infamous afternoon at St. James Park, the hostility between the two sets of fans erupted into chaos. Years of local rivalry, fueled by bragging rights and bitter memories, came to a head as the match turned ugly. Flares were lit, seats were ripped up, and waves of supporters tried to break through police lines separating the rival ends. The noise was deafening, not from chants, but from the constant clash of voices, sirens, and shouts. Outside the stadium, the battle continued, with mounted police charging to keep the crowds apart. By the end of the day, the streets of Newcastle were littered with debris. The derby's reputation for hostility cemented for another generation. West Ham United versus Chelsea, 1980. Two of London's most notorious firms, West Ham's ICF and Chelsea's Headhunters, packed into the terraces for a match that would quickly turn into a war zone. The tension was immediate, snarling faces, taunts from across the divide, and the constant thud of boots on concrete as groups moved into position. Midway through the game, the dam broke. Fists, bottles, and coins flew through the air as rival mobs surged toward each other. Stewards and police were powerless to halt the mayhem as the fighting spilled onto the pitch and into the surrounding streets. In the aftermath, dozens were injured and arrests ran into double figures, but for those who were there, the day became part of London football folklore, a brutal reminder of the era's lawless terraces. Celtic versus Rangers, 1980. The Scottish Cup final was supposed to be a showcase of the nation's best football, but when Celtic beat Rangers 1-0, the match became infamous for what followed. As the final whistle blew, thousands of rival supporters poured onto the pitch. What began as jeers and taunts quickly turned into all-out combat. Fans armed with bottles, cans, and even broken advertising boards clashed in the center circle while police, caught off guard, struggled to regain control. Mounted units charged repeatedly, but the violence raged for nearly an hour before order was restored. In the days that followed, the Scottish government introduced a nationwide ban on alcohol sales inside football grounds, a direct response to one of the most notorious riots in the history of the Old Firm rivalry. Birmingham City versus Leeds United, 1985. The final day of the season turned into one of the darkest in English football history. With Birmingham battling to avoid relegation and Leeds bringing a huge traveling support, tension filled the air long before kickoff. Midway through the match, fighting erupted on the terraces. Rival fans tore down barriers, hurled missiles, and clashed violently with police. In the chaos, a wall collapsed under the weight of the crowd, killing 15-year-old Ian Hambridge and injuring many more. The game was overshadowed by grief and outrage, and the tragedy became a grim symbol of the dangers that lurked in football grounds during the 1980s. It was a day that shook the sport and forced authorities to confront the deadly reality of hooligan violence. Millwall versus Luton Town, 1985. An FA Cup quarter-final turned into one of the most infamous nights in English football. Millwall brought thousands of traveling fans, many intent on causing trouble. From the moment they arrived, fights broke out across the town, and inside the stadium, the atmosphere was poisonous. Midway through the match, the away end erupted. Fans tore up seats, ripped down advertising boards, and hurled them at police. Hundreds spilled onto the pitch, forcing repeated stoppages as officers fought to push them back. By the final whistle, Kenilworth Road looked like a war zone. More than 700 seats were destroyed, over 40 people injured, and dozens arrested. The riot was so severe it led Luton Town to ban away supporters entirely for the next 4 years. Leeds United versus Galatasaray, 2000. What should have been a UEFA Cup semi-final first leg was overshadowed before a ball was even kicked. The night before the match, violent clashes erupted between Leeds supporters and local fans in the city's streets. Armed with knives and makeshift weapons, the confrontations turned deadly when 2 Leeds fans, Christopher Loftus and Kevin Spite, were stabbed to death. Inside the Ali Sami Yen Stadium the following evening, the atmosphere was electric with hostility. Banners taunting the victims were displayed, and missiles were thrown toward the Leeds end throughout the game. Police lines and riot squads were stationed inside the ground to prevent another tragedy. The tie went ahead, but the events in Istanbul remain one of the darkest chapters in Leeds United's history, a night when football was completely consumed by violence. Tottenham Hotspur versus Chelsea, 1975. London derbies were notorious in the 70s, but this clash between Spurs and Chelsea exploded into chaos almost from the start. Tensions on the terraces boiled over as rival mobs hurled bottles, coins, and pieces of ripped-up seating across the thin police line. Midway through the second half, hundreds of supporters charged from the stands onto the pitch, using the open space as a battleground. Fights broke out in multiple areas, forcing the match to be halted while police tried to regain control. By the time the final whistle sounded, the violence had spilled into the streets outside, where running battles continued late into the night. The incident cemented the Chelsea-Spurs rivalry as one of the most hostile in English football, and the day became another entry in London's long history of terrace warfare. Manchester United versus West Ham United, 1985. The FA Cup quarter-final brought West Ham's notorious ICF firm north in huge numbers, determined to make their presence felt. Trouble began before kickoff, with skirmishes around the city and at the railway station. Inside the ground, the noise was deafening, and the tension was thick enough to cut. When United scored, taunts and missiles flew between rival ends, and police lines struggled to hold firm. At full time, hundreds of West Ham fans charged across the terraces, clashing with home supporters in brutal hand-to-hand fights. The violence spilled into the surrounding streets and continued all the way back toward Piccadilly Station, leaving a trail of broken windows, injured supporters, and battered police. For many, it became one of the defining moments of 1980s hooligan culture. Raw, unfiltered, and unforgettable. Heysel Stadium Disaster, 1985. The European Cup final between Liverpool and Juventus should have been a celebration of football's biggest stage, but it became one of the sport's darkest days. Hours before kickoff, Liverpool fans charged a section of Juventus supporters, breaking through flimsy fencing. Trapped against a concrete wall, the crowd had nowhere to go. In the panic and crush that followed, 39 people were killed, most of them Juventus fans, and more than 600 were injured. The match shockingly went ahead despite the tragedy unfolding just minutes earlier. In the aftermath, English clubs were banned from European competition for 5 years, and Liverpool were given an additional year. Heysel was a grim reminder that football violence had reached a point where lives were being lost, and that change was no longer optional but essential. These were the moments when football crossed the line from sport to battlefield, and changed the game forever.